Turkey's first empire, the Hittite Empire. Kadesh, 1274 BCE. In May 1274 BCE, the greatest battle fought during the Bronze Age occurred near the banks of the Orontes River next to Kadesh, along the modern-day border between Lebanon and Syria. The Battle of Kadesh was fought between the armies of Ramesses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, and Muwatalli II, king of the Hittites. Strangely enough, for something which resulted in something of a stalemate and did not lead to a clear victory for either side, the Battle of Kadesh was extremely famous in antiquity. Archaeologists have found many records concerning it in Egypt, Turkey, and other parts of the Near East, and it was clearly considered a remarkable military clash in ancient times. It was also, to the best of our knowledge, the largest chariot battle in history, with the two sides bringing 5,000 or so chariots onto the field between them. There is an odd imbalance, though, in how we perceive the two sides. Everyone has heard of ancient Egypt in one form or another. The builders of the pyramids, inventors of hieroglyphic writing, and rulers of a state which existed for 3,000 years in antiquity. And Ramesses II is a famous ruler. But almost no one has heard of Muwatalli II, and few people know much at all about the Hittite Empire, a great power which ruled over much of Turkey and the Near East for hundreds of years in the second millennium BCE. This is doubly unusual, for as we will see presently, there is no shortage of available evidence with which to try and reconstruct elements of Hittite history and culture. The birth of the Hittite Empire. Before looking more at the culture and nature of the Hittite Empire, let's briefly assess how it came into being and who the Hittites were. The Hittites were an Indo-European people who had migrated into the Anatolia region in what is now Turkey as early as 4000 BCE. They did not form a distinct political state here for many centuries, and it is only from around 1800 BCE that the first stirrings of what we call the Hittite Empire began to emerge. The name Hittites is something of a misnomer. Contemporaries during the Bronze Age referred to the Hittites as Hatti or Hattians, and their kingdom as Hattusa. The name Hittites was applied to them by 19th century archaeologists who believed that the people who ruled Anatolia during the Bronze Age were synonymous with the Hittites mentioned in the Old Testament. By then, the name Hittites had become so ingrained that it continued to be used. Even the term Hattians is somewhat misleading, as this was an Akkadian term. Instead, the closest approximation to what they called themselves was Neshites or Nishians, after their first capital, a place called Nesha. The city they are most synonymous with, though, is Hattusa, the city they made their capital from around 1650 BCE onwards, at which time they were beginning to cement their status as a major power in the region. Hattusa. The capital of the Hittite Empire was the city of Hattusa, a city located in central Turkey today, a few hundred kilometers east of Ankara. Hattusa is an unusual location for the city of a great Bronze Age culture to have emerged. Typically speaking, all of the major cities and capitals of antiquity were built on the banks of the major rivers of the Near East or on the shores of the Mediterranean and other seas. These include Memphis and Thebes in Egypt on the banks of the River Nile, and cities like Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, while most Greek, Minoan, and Phoenician cities are on the shores of the Mediterranean. Instead, Hattusa lies inland in the middle of the north-central Anatolian mountain region. This reflected the Hittites' origins as a nomadic people who were very reliant on pastoral farming and the keeping of large herds of livestock. Hattusa was actually one of the first major Bronze Age capitals discovered by archaeologists. It was first examined in 1834 by Charles Texier, a French archaeologist attached to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This means Hattusa was rediscovered long before places like ancient Mycenae and Knossos, and when Egyptology was still only in its infancy. At the height of the Hittite Empire, Hattusa covered some 2 square kilometers of land. The city was divided into an inner and outer city, both surrounded by impressive walls. The remains of the bottom of these have been found intact by archaeologists, while some segments have been rebuilt to show how imposing they would have been. They were double walls, meaning one wall was built on the outer end. Then a gap was left in the middle, and a second layer was built on the inside. The layers were 3 meters thick, and the height varied between 7 and 10 meters or so, making these extremely hard to breach. On top of this, Hattusa followed the typical Bronze Age pattern of having a great fortress built on an acropolis or raised area in the center of the city. Unfortunately, while Texier might have discovered Hattusa almost 2 centuries ago, extensive parts of the city had been completely destroyed in antiquity when the Hittite Empire collapsed in the 12th century BCE. Therefore, there are only limited remains of the city left today. One of the most important facets of it is the Lion's Gate. This was one of 6 main gates which led into Hattusa. The gate was flanked by 2 large lion statues from which its name is derived. At the height of the empire, the gates were opened and closed with 2 sets of heavy wooden doors covered with bronze sheeting for additional strength. Towers would have flanked it on either side, ensuring that if any invader managed to break through the outer gate, the region in between would have essentially become a killing pit, with the attackers massacred below while they attempted to break through the second gate. There were also sphinxes, the half-man, half-lion creatures so beloved by Egyptian sculptors, found at the site of what was one of the other main gates leading into the city, generally called the Sphinx Gate today. These point towards the level of cultural osmosis which was taking place in the Bronze Age world. Just as the Hittites borrowed their writing system from their neighbors, they also incorporated elements of Egyptian mythology and statuary into their building work, despite Egypt having been the major rival of the Hittites for hundreds of years in the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE. At the heart of the inner city on the Acropolis, there was a fortress, a royal palace, a complex of temples, and what must have been administrative buildings of one kind or another. Little of these have survived down to modern times, but the outlines of the building work have been plotted out by archaeologists. A striking feature of this Acropolis was the Hattusa Ramp, a 250-meter-long stone rampart, which was 80 meters wide with a tunnel running through it. The temples on the Acropolis were complemented by a range of temples in the outer city. The housing of the common people here would have been constructed of ephemeral materials like wattle and daub and wood that have left almost no record of ever having been there. At its height, in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, there were probably somewhere in the region of 40,000 to 50,000 people living here, making Hattusa an exceptionally large city by Bronze Age standards, especially one that was built away from a coastal region or a major river. The Old and Middle Kingdoms. Hittite history is divided into 3 major periods. After an early formative period in which the Hittite people were broadly united for the first time into a strong kingdom, the Old Kingdom began shortly after 1700 BCE. Its first major monarch was Hattusili I, who ruled in the middle of the 17th century BCE and began expanding the Hittite dominions beyond central Anatolia, launching raids against the Amorite kingdom of northern Syria. The Old Kingdom lasted down to around 1500 BCE. While Hittite power became substantial during it, they were still held back by rivalry with the Hurrian people in Anatolia itself. The Middle Kingdom that followed briefly between 1500 BCE and 1430 BCE saw the Hittites emerge as a major power by consolidating their control over central and eastern Anatolia and expanding into western Anatolia and Syria. Hattusa was also firmly established during this time as the capital. Hittite Cuneiform. A key development in their early history was that the Hittites, who hailed from a part of Eurasia which had not been a center of major civilization prior to the 2nd millennium BCE, made contact with the more advanced cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, where writing systems and sophisticated forms of government and trade had begun to develop over 1,000 years earlier. In particular, the Hittites began campaigning into Syria and northern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the 17th century BCE. A theory which is favored by Hittite scholars today is that these campaigns resulted in Hittite rulers like Hattusa I bringing Babylonian scholars from Mesopotamia back to their court at Hattusa, where they began to develop a government bureaucracy of the kind which had allowed Mesopotamian rulers to raise higher taxes and field larger armies for many centuries. We know this because the Hittite written script is an adapted version of the cuneiform script which had first been developed in Mesopotamia in the late 4th millennium BCE. Thereafter, the Hittite Empire became stronger. The employment of Babylonian scribes at Hattusa, who would have trained a generation of Hittite scribes to succeed them, allowed for the development of a stronger government, one which was capable of conducting diplomacy with neighboring powers and extending its power much further than it previously had. The Hittite Tablet Collection. The main reason we know much of anything about the Hittites today is owing to a very fortuitous discovery that was made in the early 20th century. During several seasons of excavations between 1906 and 1912 at the site of Hattusa, near the modern town of Boğazkale, the German archaeologist and Orientalist Hugo Winkler, in conjunction with a Turkish scholar, Theodor Macready Bey, uncovered a vast collection of some 25,000 clay tablets that clearly constituted the remains of a central Hittite archive and library at Hattusa. This subsequently became known as the Boğazköy Archive. This enormous collection of tablets includes documents like treaties between the Hittites and their neighbors, legal texts and inventories of royal collections and stores. These include several accounts, for instance, of the Battle of Kadesh. There is also a rich correspondence between the Hittite kings and their counterparts in places like New Kingdom Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon in Mesopotamia. The various Greek states to the west, and powers like the Mitanni and Canaanites in the Levant and Syria. Beyond these, the Boğazköy Archive contains a wealth of documents on Hittite religious life and many incidental documents which shed light on everything from Hittite mythology and literature to the primitive medicine practiced at Hattusa 3,500 years ago. That this collection survived as long as it did until Winkler and his team started digging the tablets out of the ground in the early 20th century was entirely owing to the manner in which they were produced. The documents were carved in cuneiform into clay tablets that are durable and can survive over thousands of years. Were these written out on papyrus scrolls of the kind which the Greeks and Romans used a millennium and a half later, then they would almost certainly be having decayed and disintegrated many centuries ago, these being far less durable writing materials that have only survived from ancient times in rare instances. Indeed, the 25,000 clay tablets are useful for studying many other ancient societies. Beyond Hittite cuneiform, the tablets are written in at least 7 other languages, some being Akkadian or Sumerian texts from Mesopotamia, some being in the Hurrian language of the Mitanni people of Syria, while there are also texts written in much more obscure languages, Luwian, Palaic, and Hattic, the latter being a Proto-Hittite language that was developing as their writing system early on before they adopted Mesopotamian cuneiform for their written texts. There are even tablets written in a language which scholars have never been able to translate or identify the origins of. With the riches of the Bagaskoi archive, we can reconstruct a lot about the Hittite Empire, its government, culture, society, and religion. Religion. Like all of their neighbors and virtually every major civilization of the Near East and Mediterranean world in antiquity, the Hittites were polytheists. They worshipped a pantheon of goddesses and gods as part of an immanent religious system, the notion being that individual deities intervened directly in the world to affect things like the weather, the harvest, and life and death. Clearly, their religious system and mythology was influenced by their neighbors, and the religion of the Hittites was so close to that of their near neighbors, the Hurrians, that they are often treated as one and the same. Possibly the most prominent god within their system was Tahuna, a weather god who was referred to as the Lord of the Heavens or the Lord of Hatti. He was responsible for things like thunder and lightning, and there is a clear parallel to be drawn between him and Zeus, the king of the gods in the Greek system. A sun goddess with various different names was worshipped at a major cult center at Arena outside Hattusa. This sun goddess and Tahuna begot the other Hittite deities. Below them were a series of major deities, which again often had parallels in Greek, Roman, and Egyptian traditions in antiquity. Inara was a Hittite equivalent of Artemis and was the patron of wild animals and the hunt. Like all ancient religions, the Hittite system involved temples, shrines, and a range of festivals which intermingled with a complex mythological system. For instance, the New Year was marked in the Hittite calendar by reenactments of the tale of the slaying of the dragon, when Tahuna and Inara had aided a human named Hupasiya in slaying a dragon or serpent. These tales reoccurred in many elements of Hittite literature. Hittite literature. The Bagaskoi archive and other survivals provide some basic insight into Hittite literature. The oldest known Hittite text is the Anita text or Deeds of Anita. Anita was a Hittite king of the mid-18th century BCE. The deeds are effectively a history of his reign. We have a range of cuneiform tablets that shed light on elements of Hittite culture, even though they were functional documents. One is a copy of a Hittite military oath which is preserved on 2 separate tablets that have survived down to the present day. It reveals much about Hittite customs. The moon and love deities, Kusu and Ishara, were invoked, and the soldiers were made to swear that they would wish to become deaf and blind before betraying their loyalties to the kingdom. Fragmentary tablets reveal elements of Hittite law. These are known as the Code of the Nesilim and included provisions for punishing a wide range of crimes including witchcraft, theft, and murder, while Hittite attitudes towards divorce and the mistreatment of slaves are also revealed. From a more literary perspective, we have surviving fragments of mythological stories which the Hittites told. Many of these are derived from a complex literary cycle which the Hittites and the Hurrian people of Anatolia made central to their culture. We know these as the Kumarbi cycle today. The cycle involved a canon of stories, which were loosely based around the god Kumarbi, and which included celestial stories of the gods and goddesses and their interactions with the human world. There are 5 key parts to the Kumarbi cycle, they being the Song of Kumarbi, the Song of Lama, the Song of Silva, the Song of Hedamu, and the Song of Ulukumi. These drew on different cultural traditions. Some of them were clearly derived from elements of Assyrian mythology to the southeast of the Hittite Empire. As such, while these myths did not originate entirely amongst the Hittites, they did absorb and adapt them. Although fragmentary today, it is plausible to imagine these as a Hittite version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, occupying a similar place within their literary and mythological tradition as that story did in ancient Mesopotamia. The Hittite New Kingdom. The Hittite Empire reached its peak during the New Kingdom. This began around 1430 BCE and lasted down to 1180 BCE when the Hittite Empire was conquered, but its neighbors and newcomers to the Eastern Mediterranean. During this era, a sophisticated governmental system evolved, whereby lands that were under Hittite control were administered by royal officials, and tributes were sent back to the royal treasury in Hattusa. This, in turn, allowed for the financing of ambitious building projects at Hattusa, and much of the city's more spectacular architectural features date to the New Kingdom era. The empire also reached its maximum geographical extent during the New Kingdom period, particularly during the reign of Suppiluliuma I. He is understood to have ruled the empire for nearly 3 decades between 1350 BCE and 1320 BCE. During that time, the empire grew to cover about 2/3 of modern-day Turkey, the exceptions being the far west, which remained outside Hittite control and in the Mycenaean sphere of influence. The Hittites also expanded beyond Anatolia into the regions approximating today with Lebanon and parts of Syria. Though primarily a terrestrial force, the Hittites took advantage of the collapse of Minoan power in the Eastern Mediterranean a century earlier to acquire influence in Cyprus as well, the primary source of copper for all of the civilizations of the Near East at the time. Rivalry with Egypt and empire at greatest extent. The rise of the Hittite New Kingdom occurred at a time when numerous other strong powers were emerging in the world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. Indeed, this was clearly a period of unprecedented wealth and material progress up to that time in human history. The cultures that traded around the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East were transporting things like decorated pottery, incense, expensive woods like Byblos cedar wood, and intricately crafted jewelry and metalwork over hundreds of kilometers. Temples of a kind which had not been seen before proliferated, and there were evidently the beginnings of what we might call a middle class in some societies here. This brought wealth and prosperity to the Hittites, but it also ensured they had rivals. It wasn't just the Hittites that were doing well. So were groups like the Mycenaeans in Greece and the Assyrians and Babylonians in Mesopotamia. However, the most powerful of these other Bronze Age kingdoms was New Kingdom Egypt, a polity whose power peaked between the 15th and 13th centuries BCE, right around the same time that the New Kingdom emerged in the Hittite Empire. The rivalry between the Hittites and the Egyptians centered on control of the Levant, the region that runs along the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine are all situated today. There were many very wealthy ports here inhabited by groups like the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. These included the cities of Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and Ashkelon. Egypt had expanded into the southern end of the Levant and cemented its control over the region during the reign of Thutmose III in the middle of the 15th century BCE, while the Hittites held influence in the north. Wars followed frequently over the next 2 centuries. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE was the peak of the conflict, an enormous battle which was known throughout the known world. Still, it didn't resolve the conflict. As epic as the Battle of Kadesh might have been, it ended in something of a stalemate, and the Hittite rivalry with the Egyptians for control over the Levant would continue. Ultimately, the rivalry here would ebb and flow, with some rulers in Hattusa and Thebes in Egypt agreeing to marry their children to one another and briefly make peace before soon returning to war after a few years. In the end, it would take a decisive blow against the Hittites by a different power altogether for the Hittite-Egyptian conflict to come to a complete end. The Hittite Empire and the Late Bronze Age collapse. The Hittite Empire was perhaps the greatest victim of all of what archaeologists and historians of antiquity call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Already, by the time of the Battle of Kadesh, disease outbreaks and harvest failures had been disrupting the societies of the Eastern Mediterranean for some time, while wars were also causing problems. For instance, the very advanced culture of the Minoans on Crete was largely destroyed by the 14th century BCE through a combination of disease, famines, natural disasters, and invasion by the Greek Mycenaeans. What turned this crisis into a full-blown societal collapse in many regions in the 13th century BCE was the invasion of the Eastern Mediterranean world by large armies of mysterious newcomers. The foremost such group were the Sea People, a people whose origins remain unclear to this day. Many historians now believed they came to the Eastern Mediterranean from further to the west around Sicily and Sardinia. But they could ultimately have come south into Italy from Central Europe. What is clear is that they arrived to the Eastern Mediterranean in such numbers that they devastated the societies here. The Egyptians, for instance, managed to fight them off eventually in the 12th century BCE, but by then, after decades of war and raids of their towns and cities, the New Kingdom was fatally weakened and Egypt descended into a period known as the Third Intermediate Period. Similarly, the Mycenaeans were decimated as a power by both the Sea People and the Dorians, who invaded northern Greece through the Balkans. The Hittites experienced the worst demise of all. While Egyptian and Mycenaean culture went into decline, as did Mesopotamia, the cultures here did ultimately survive and resurface in the Iron Age. Not so with the Hittites. The Sea People began raiding the southern shores of Anatolia in the second half of the 13th century BCE, especially so after they established control over Cyprus. By 1200, BCE Hittite power had severely declined as a result. Moreover, the Hittites were being attacked from two sides. To the north, other groups like the Phrygians and Cascians had descended from the Pontic-Caspian steppe through the Caucasus to attack the Hittite Empire from the northern end. Then, to make matters even worse, archaeological data indicates that climactic change caused a period of severe drought in Anatolia in the first years of the 12th century BCE, doubtlessly leading to famine-like conditions at a time when the Hittites could scarcely deal with it. The end came around 1180 BCE, when Hattusa was burned to the ground, and many of its temples and civic buildings were destroyed under the pressure of combined attacks by the Sea People, Cascians, Phrygians, and others. More than any other power, the Late Bronze Age collapse led to the complete destruction of the Hittite Empire. Nevertheless, its legacy would continue to live on, and many elements of its culture, from its religion to its stone carving, continued to influence cultures in the region in subtle ways for centuries to come. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to show your support, and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.